All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with Diana and Tim.
Hey,
We're going to have some fun, right? Like faith and politics in the public square. Nothing brings the people together.
it's a
Are we
hoot.
crazy?
When I think of fun, I think of faith and politics. Totally.
Well, at least that's the kind of fun I like having with Diana.
True.
I like how Lori requested the horn. You know, this is what I'm talking about. I know everyone doesn't request it, but Lori did. So, then I aim to please people that share my intuitions, namely that it's always a good time to hit an air horn. That one's for you, Tim. You get
Thank
your
you.
own air horn moment too.
Well, Trip, you should give an air horn for yourself. It's your birthday today, right?
Oh,
No, is it?
It is.
Air horn, please. I insist.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Happy birthday, Trip.
And on top of being my birthday, I just got back from the DMV where my oldest now has a driver's license.
Oh, well, that's quite a birthday present.
Yeah.
It's a whole different experience.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. And he finished his last exam last week. And I didn't think about it until I'm driving home that I won't be driving him to school till maybe I drop him off at college or something. And I was just in a mood. That's
funny. I believe it.
My daughter's grandfather, he had 8 grandchildren. And his deal with each grandchild was that if they got through the first year without getting a ticket or having an accident, that he gave them $100. And I mean, that was kind of not an inconsiderable amount of money. And Emma was the youngest. My daughter was the youngest of the 8 grandchildren, and she's the only one who got the $100. But then I think it was just right after that she accidentally forgot to put the parking brake on the car, and it went down the driveway, which is on a hill, and ran into the Volkswagen across the street.
Oh my gosh.
But she wasn't in the car. She didn't cause the accident. She just forgot the parking brake.
Wow.
So, and the neighbors forgave her nicely, which was very kind of them.
Well, yeah, that would not be ideal. But no one got hurt. And my parents shared with Elgin that my first accident was when I confused reverse and drive and ran into the house.
Oh no.
And so he's like, well, as long as I avoid that, I should be good.
Right. Just don't hit the house. Can do.
Pretty much everything is better than that.
Yeah. So
well, that's a good way to start. Happy birthday.
Yes, that's very, very glad to be here and spending it with y'all. And then later, the release of the Acolyte, the new Star Wars show for all you nerds out there. So this is the first of the kind of intro session for Faith and Politics in the Public Square. If for some reason you aren't getting emails or haven't signed up yet and all that kind of stuff, you can go to faithandpolitics.net. That's where it goes down. It's donation-based, including $0. And then you'll get invited into the Facebook group. You'll get sent each of the weeks after our live session. You'll get sent 2 videos that are shorter videos, around 30 minutes, from different scholars. This coming week, you'll get 2 looking at Christian nationalism, Christian reconstruction, and trying to get an idea of what's going on in the present around the kind of the problems that we keep showing up in the public square. And then the 2 following weeks, you'll hear from 2 different theologians and ethicists about different perspectives that are live in the history of the church and in the American theological tradition. And really the goal for us in this process is that we'll be processing things all together, the 3 of us in conversation with y'all, but also giving people to hear scholars articulate different positions and how it's grounded in the Christian tradition, how it engages the public square, and what is it like to think about political theology without feeling gross and nasty like too often is the case. So that's kind of how it works during these live streams. When you have questions, you'll notice people just chat the whole time. So if it's a question, put the word question, maybe all caps before it. That way I can mark it and save it. But that's not the only way. You can respond to any of the class emails with questions, and then I put them in a Google Doc and organize them and such. So maybe next week, you watch Julie's lecture on Christian Reconstruction, and you're like, WTF, is this real? This goes down. This is wild and crazy. And you have a question, because you'll find out later today that Tim might be a little more familiar with that experience than we are. And you want to hear what was it like growing up in a context where this was a live option. And then others are like, is this for real? Like, where did this come from? Diana, I have another historical question. She and Julie are friends. You could ask that. And then we got to follow up and discuss it. Things like that could happen. And so you can reply to any of the emails, drop them in live. These videos that happen live and the audio will be on the class resource page along with the lectures. And you'll get those sent tomorrow in an email saying, oh, if you missed it or didn't stay for the whole thing yesterday, you can go get it here. And here's the lectures for the week. Send us questions.
So tomorrow people get this video, or this will be available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And tomorrow they're also going to get the first 2 mini lectures.
Yes.
In their email. Okay, great.
Robbie and Julie, they'll get that. So you have a week to watch them, send questions, comments, discuss and such. And then we'll be back on here next week, same time, same pod channel, or I don't know. It's not a bat channel. Yeah. Tim doesn't know. He's too young to know the original Batman TV show.
I wish I was as young as Tim.
Oh, wait, do you mean like the live action one?
Yes.
I watched it as a kid.
Well, apparently not enough to know that at the end it talks about coming back to the same bat channel.
No, I watched the movie. Wasn't there a feature-length movie?
Yeah, there's been 6
no
different Batmans.
The original one. Like who's the plot was the Joker had this machine that would dehydrate people.
Oh yeah, that was the movie of the characters that were in the original TV show.
See, I'm hip. I'm cool.
Wow.
Yeah,
I had forgotten that.
Yeah, it was exciting. Anyway, so what we're going to do today, we're going to have 3 chunks of introductory moments. Diana, Tim, and I each have something we'll share. Then we'll discuss with each other what's going on. Obviously, y'all can drop questions. If we don't end up talking long, we'll get to answer more questions at the end or save some more for next week. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diana, and Tim and I will disappear until the conversation starts.
Oh. Trip, you're back. I'm there. I am. Okay. Well, hey, everybody. I am really, I think, tentatively happy to be talking about faith and politics, because this is a really fraught issue, and that's the tentative part. But it's also something I really care about, and that's the happier part. I have written sometime in a couple of my books about how my mother would tell me that among my very first words that I could say as a little kid were the words John Kennedy. And that's because my mom was a campaign worker on that election. And I was born in very early 1959. And so as I was just an infant, she would take me around in my stroller while she was delivering literature, while she was talking to people about voting for Jack Kennedy. And apparently Kennedy was something that I could say when I was really little. And I was also around church all the time. And I wrote in my Substack just this last week that if somebody wrote a biography of me, they might want to call it Jesus and John Kennedy, because Jesus was another name I knew of a figure that wasn't in my family, but I heard his name so much too. I could say that name when I was really young. And so that's really the frame of my life, is religion and politics. And one of the things that means for me, as a scholar and as a historian, and just as a person who's a writer, as a friend to you all, is that I don't really understand when churches and church people say, oh, we can't talk about religion and politics here. or the gospel is not political. I literally, my head just sort of turns and my eyes squint, and I don't know what you're talking about. Uh, because those two things, how we live in community and our engagement with the life of God in the world, and our engagement in the world with one another, are the two most important things that I have cared about since I can remember. So I have really struggled, particularly with my mostly, mainline Protestant friends, when they'll say things like that. "Oh, our church doesn't talk about politics," or "Jesus didn't care about politics," or "Don't you understand that Jesus said, well, just render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God which is God, and we want to get along, and we want to be nice, so we're not going to talk about these really divisive things in our church." Well, church itself is divisive. And you don't need much help, in other words, to talk about a subject in church that is already divisive. So anyway, this strange kind of journey that I've been on since my own earliest childhood memories about faith and politics, and my vocational life and my life as a writer, um, have really collided, with often the people that I work most frequently with. And I've developed along the way sort of two principles, and I want to share those principles with you. And I think that these principles are drawn from mostly my understanding of history. And that is, first of all, the gospel is political, but it's never partisan. Somebody just said that in the comments, which I love. And I had said that for years. The gospel is always political, but it's not partisan. And then I revised it just a little bit along the way. And that is, the gospel is political, but it's not partisan, except in one thing. And that one thing is, it's always partisan for love. And what we get in the New Testament itself is a picture of the kingdom of God. We get Jesus talking about that, and the kingdom of God is both an inner reality, and it's a hope for the actual world that we inhabit. It has both of those dimensions, and those dimensions are not exclusive to one another. Just this week, I believe we've celebrated the anniversary of the Barmen Declaration, which was the great anti-fascist, anti-Hitler statement that was primarily written by Karl Barth. And in that statement, Barth talks about how the gospel is inherently political, and then goes on to say that nevertheless, this sort of radical, overly politicized, partisan politics, you can't go that far either. And I think that's what the gospel itself does model. It models a Jesus and his disciples and his earliest followers who care deeply about the shape of the world in which they live. And yet, all of the different political options that are around them in the time in which they inhabited this question, the Essenes and the Zealots and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, all these different political religious parties, they were critical of all of them. And they occasionally agreed with some of these parties on certain kinds of things, but they also always had questions. And I think that that's a great model that I try to carry with me. Um, the gospel is political, it's not partisan, except in the case of love. And, it does mean that there's always questions about political parties. So that's really my first principle that I try to talk about when I go into a church and someone challenges me around the idea of faith and politics. I lay that out and invite a conversation about that principle. The second thing is distinctly historical and ethical. And this comment comes from Alistair MacIntyre, who was an ethicist, and he knew history really well. And I have leaned into this quote for a long time because it's about tradition. And that's what historians do, is that we are looking at um, these long lines of tradition that run through politics and social arrangements and the ways in which people live in the world. And especially when you're a historian of Christianity, like I am, tradition is a really important dimension of the work that I do and the work that I've thought about over so many decades now. And MacIntyre said this: tradition is an argument extended through time in which certain fundamental agreements are defined and redefined. And I want you to hear that again. Tradition is an argument extended through time. In other words, if we start talking about like the traditions of faith and politics, if we start talking about how people engage in the social order with their faith, we're talking about an argument that has lasted a really long time. Tradition itself is the argument. And to me, that is so important, particularly for the folks that I work with on a regular basis who want to avoid arguments around religion and politics. If you are a Christian and if you care about tradition, tradition is the argument. That is an incredible definition of tradition. Tradition is an argument extended through time in which certain agreements, fundamental agreements, are not just maintained, not just beat into your skull, but rather in which certain fundamental agreements are defined and then redefined. And that's the few that's what I want to follow up on just for a couple more minutes with you before opening up to Tim and Trip to ask me some questions. If we think about faith and politics as being a set of questions and traditions that have passed down through the Christian churches, through the whole of Christian history, we can see a lot of really interesting things. You know, we look at the New Testament itself, and the Gospels, I would argue, are primarily an anti-imperial narratives. Luke is a little bit more friendly towards Rome, but even Luke doesn't really like Rome, and he's trying to navigate some pretty difficult stuff. And it makes sense. Jesus was a critic of Rome, and Jesus was a critic of any kind of political arrangement that didn't meet the standard of love God and love your neighbor as yourself, that did not match up with the kingdom of God. But then you get into the epistles, and something different is happening there. You see leaders like Paul, and you see the author of, say, First Peter, trying to figure out not just their anger at the Roman Empire, but also trying to figure out how do we do this? How do we follow a Jesus who was killed by the empire, and yet we still have to live with this thing? And Paul, who wrote so much of the New Testament, himself is a Roman citizen, which is not the most common thing. Not every Jew was a Roman citizen, but he was. And so, the famous verse, the one that I think I have engraved in my mind, is Romans 1:1. Let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Um, so, that is Paul being compliant? Is Paul saying we have to just go along with whoever and whatever is ruling over us, and that it ultimately doesn't matter? And that sentiment seems to be echoed by some other, like I said, writers of the epistles in the New Testament period. So you get something like 1 Peter 2:17. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. I don't know. I don't know what planet that author was living on. I'm Because I can't imagine Jesus saying that. I mean, I could hear Jesus saying, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, but honor the emperor? Um, Subvert the empire, maybe something else. But that is in the New Testament. And so you see that the argument about faith and politics sets up in the earliest years of the Christian church. It sets up within the pages of the New Testament itself. And through all of these centuries, Christians have sort of appealed to one side of this or the other. How do we live? Is it anti-imperial? Is it anti corrupted ruling authorities? How do you know when a ruling authority is corrupt and should not be obeyed? What does it really mean to let every person be subject to governing authorities? Where's justice? Where's the principle of love your neighbor? How do we honor the emperor when the emperor perhaps is evil? And so what we're looking at in the questions of faith and politics is not some recent development. It's not something that's just like a random set of subjects by which we want to torture pastors by introducing the subject to their churches, and they're going to get in trouble and get fired for raising issues of faith and politics. That's not the case at all. This is part of the very tradition of the New Testament, an argument that extends through time about the relationship between the life of faith and the governing authorities. What is it? And the simplest sort of way that a historian looks at this, and I will talk about this at other points along our journey, is that we look at, well, how did that develop? Through different cultures and different time periods. And just a cursory knowledge of church history reveals that Christians have answered the questions of faith and politics in a myriad of different ways over time. The empire did eventually win out in the early church, and empire and faith became almost coterminous. And the empire falls. It falls in stages across the Mediterranean world. And so the Eastern Empire retains some aspects of the linkages of church and state that were established in the 4th and 5th centuries, whereas the Western Empire becomes a much more ragged mess. And in certain ways, the functions of state and the functions of government fall to the clergy themselves, to bishops, to the Pope in Rome, to the monasteries. And they wind up kind of picking up the pieces of ancient Rome. And as they pick up those pieces of ancient Rome, they become much more like the empire, perhaps, than they are different from it. And so you get this argument about who's in charge, church or state, or some relationship, some amalgam of the two. The Reformation, a central question of the Protestant Reformation was, what is the relationship between the church and governing authorities? And Protestants were loath to accept the Catholic answers that had passed to them through the 14th, 15th centuries. And instead, they came up with not one Protestant answer to the question of church and state, but 3 or 4. And every one of the denominations that we refer to as mainstream or traditional denominations still lives in the heritage of those couple different Protestant options. And the Catholic Church still struggles with its once great sort of coherence of church and state, a genuine sort of earthly theocracy, and how that works itself out in contemporary time. And the whole sort of the whole kind of faith and politics project was upended in the 17th and 18th centuries, as many people in Western Europe in particular began to think about this new political idea of democracy and how is democracy related to religion. And in the United States, where huge amounts of our readers and listeners are, we came up with some very interesting suggestions to solve that problem theologically. Came up with ideas about religious freedom, both from the church itself and from secular people like Thomas Jefferson. And we came up with ideas about diversity and how diverse peoples cooperate. And we came up with ideas about voluntary institutions and how they function to change political environments and political questions in a state. African Americans came up with a really distinctive tradition of faith and politics, one that works from the underside of American power. And so I love talking about faith and politics because faith and politics is central to the New Testament. It's central to the historical development of Christianity. It's central to Protestant identity. It's central to political questions of human rights, the dignity of individuals, and how we structure societies, either democratically or in Republican terms. How do we do that? And I think these questions are central for the future, and that the centrality of the question for the future will revolve around how in the world do we live in technologically connected global reality in ways that think about pluralistic societies facing literally earth-shattering problems. These are not questions that can be ignored, and they are not questions that our ancestors ever ignored. And we diminish their honor when we refuse to talk about faith and politics. And so that's my apologia, in part, that I give in churches when they tell me that I'm not supposed to talk about these subjects. You're probably not being a very good Christian if you're unwilling to talk about faith and politics.
Thank you, Diana.
You're welcome.
All right.
End of sermon today.
Well, and luckily we're all live streaming, so we can't just pass a plate around or ask you to walk down the aisle. But if you want to see what Diana does in a tent revival preaching setting, you can come to Theology Beer Camp, where we already rented a giant tent for Diana to drop a sermon after Flamey Grant and Ivy King rock the music. So I'm just saying, if you wanted that, it could happen. Tim, what came to mind for you?
Oh man, I mean, I it's a lot of food for thought for me. I'm always thinking about how we take some of these things we see in Scripture, and in the broader Christian tradition, and then what do we do with them today? I mean, one example is this, obey the governing authorities, Romans 13 kind of line that, in my tradition, kind of seemed weaponized when it was convenient to ignore like COVID mandates and stuff, right? And we have an obligation at this point to resist tyranny, so Romans 13 doesn't apply. And then whenever it suits those people, well, Romans 13, the governing authorities. So I'm just kind of curious for you, is like, what is the framework that you're thinking through? I know you said love, but even that, that word tends to be used by a lot of people, and many who I would argue twist it for hate. How do you navigate the wisdom of those kinds of verses, and then how we would think about that in today's context in a democracy, which Paul wasn't a part of, and then what do we advocate for? And then I have one more follow-up question about that.
Well, obviously, that's a great question. I think that's one we'll be pursuing over the coming weeks. But I think that the way you talk about it from your own experience is, in effect, one of the answers to the question. And that is when we come across these different verses in scripture that are about faith and politics, we have kind of standard interpretations of them until those standard interpretations back up over and against something else we really believe. And then we will very quickly sort of reverse course. And that shows that I think there's a kind of a lack of consistent reflection. I too experienced a tradition where that Romans 1:1 verse was weaponized. So as soon as you say that, I recognize it. But it is really ironic that the very people who held that out for so long as a weapon to beat on people like me, as soon as they came across something they wanted to disagree with,
Right.
they immediately appealed to what I think is actually correct is that sure we are subject to governing authorities. I'm looking down at my paper, make sure I have the right term. Yet even they say, oh, well, there's a clause here. There's an exception clause.
Yeah.
And the exception clause is something perceived to be unjust.
Right.
And so I think that in effect that becomes that becomes an interpretation that we can share. It's like, yeah, well, that's what I've been telling you all along,
Right.
until it's unjust. But then comes the second half of the argument. And the second half of the argument is, well, what is then unjust?
Right.
And so I think in effect you answered your own question. Because that's the way I would pursue that. If I was having an argument or a discussion with somebody who disagreed with me on some of these issues.
Yeah.
Part of the problem right now, of course, is that nobody wants to talk to each other when we disagree with about these issues.
Yeah.
But that's a different kind of subject.
That makes sense. My second question was,
the thing about love.
It was regarding this idea of, I do believe that, as Christians, we're called to be like, little Christ and little kingdom representatives, I guess you can say. And how do you think, and especially with your knowledge of church history, the balancing act between working within an empire to change an empire to be more just and loving and et cetera, versus becoming the empire and using the power of the empire to actually maybe get an ethic across that was never designed to be used or implemented that way, and how you wrestle with that tension of, we live in the world's biggest empire, and arguably one of the most violent empires in the history of the world. And we're seeing that now, but also we're here and we have to do something. So I'm just kind of wondering what you think about that and how maybe some other folks in church history have answered that same question in their time.
I immediately think about the monastic movements because at the same time when the empire was basically taking over Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries, there were some people who said, we can't go along with this. And they literally left the empire. They went to the only sort of empty space they could find, which was generally the deserts that were sort of outside of the reach of empire. And they set up, these great monastic or hermitage kinds of communities. And so that was one of the early answers to your question, is that it can't be saved. And not only it can't be saved, but if we stay here, the faith itself will become deeply corrupted. And so, this is what I think that Rod Dreyer tries to talk about as the Benedictine option. And there's a lot of truth in that. There are people who took this kind of option. And they have given a lot in terms of the life of the church over time. So I'm not quick to dismiss the Benedictine option. It's just
Right.
like, well, how do you imagine what the Benedictine option is? And if you ever
Right.
talk to a real Benedictine, they don't recognize what Rod Dreher talks about in his book as being that option. And I think it does revolve around one of the things that you said. You know, we're supposed to be little Christ in a very real sense. That's kind of a more evangelical way of putting something that's central to Christianity and central to the question, is that Catholics and a lot of more sort of liturgical Protestants would talk about how we're called to live in imitation of Christ. And so that to me always becomes the test of politics.
Yeah.
And in the 19th century, it was kind of a corny question. What would Jesus do?
Right.
But that question, what would Jesus do, came out of liberal progressive Protestantism. It did not come out of evangelicals. And the reason why the question is so important is that when you get to these knotty questions of church and state, the preference for people who are baptized, people who really care about faith and to follow Jesus, is to ask that question. And, you know, how do we live with this in imitation of Christ? And so, you know, for us, that means, you know, how do you live as an American? How do you live as a Canadian? How do you live in the remnants of colonial Britain? How do you live in Russia? You know, as a person of faith, vis-a-vis these structures, which are so deeply flawed, unfair, unjust, and violent.
Yeah.
And so this is part of why tradition is an argument extended through time. It's something that's never really solved.
Yeah.
It really calls for us to bring our best selves to the question.
Yeah, it's good.
So one thing about just that notion of tradition, and I don't know if we talked about this before or not, but when I teach philosophy of religion, one of the things I look at when looking at the history of religious traditions is both MacIntyre's notion of tradition as conversation and Gadamer, the kind of like or phenomenologist notion of tradition, and combining them two to help people recognize just what it is, because once you recognize that traditions are alive, then what is it that they're giving us if it's not conclusions or not answers, right? Because they're unfinished. They're actually giving us a framing and a narrative and a community for asking questions.
That's
and
right.
So there's this shift of what is primary or what is essential as the questions. And I think you raised a number of them, like love or love of neighbor, love of enemy, these kinds of things. And the story, right? The story is grounded on Jesus. And then even in our early text is a tradition that's like, now what do you do? My name is Paul and I'm a convert and I'm a Roman citizen. And then Constantine's like, oh no. And then Augustine sees the fall of the empire and he's like, I don't know, let me write 800 pages about it, right? So like when the tradition is grounded in the community of shared stories and questions, then I think there's like this ability to take a bit of an exhale, because you can't ask every question at once.
Right.
And one of the graces of a living tradition and not a completed one is that you get to ask them one at a time. Like part of when you ask a question as a Christian political theologian, right? Like to ask a political theology question, you're asking it from within a tradition where those narratives are still there. And that narrative and that tradition and those stories are always already plural. Is plural in the New Testament. Like Diana has to give a reminder that Luke's a little bit more friendly to Rome than the other ones. And he knew he was, and that's why he edited it that way. And Dom Crossan spent a lot of time emphasizing it. And then, and you can see what happens in Revelation, this very different picture of coercive power and such than what happens in the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah,
right?
John hates empire.
Right. And
Right.
so the one of the things that I have found show up in kind of using MacIntyre and Gadamer on tradition to emphasize is that like when you recognize the living nature of a tradition, then the tradition itself is not the object of thought. And And a lot of people, when they ask faith and politics questions and they get anxious in the public square, or fearful about change, and they have a question, what they're wanting is the one correct answer, and not the actual grace a tradition gives, that it's open, that it's alive, that there are stories and multiple voices to wrestle with. And so there's this shift that happens in recognizing a living tradition from seeing the tradition as a boundary to a horizon, right? The horizon changes as you move forward. It's moving from seeing the tradition as a walled space, and every denomination has where their walls are drawn for what reasons, to a centered space that is grounded in the narrative of Jesus and the people that have wrestled with it afterwards, and that it's not finished, but it's in process. And just that shifting of it then opens up like a recognition, right back to where you started, Diana, that the gospel is political, because politics is how we figure out how to mediate our relationships with God, neighbor, nature, enemy. And if you aren't going to think about it, critically and risk faithfulness in new ways, then you're either admitting the tradition's dead or that your faith is dead when it comes to these questions. Anyway, I loved what you said, and that was what got me pumped.
Yeah.
I'll just close with a quick story about my own history, and this is, to me, an illustration of exactly what you're saying. And we can talk about it in theory. We can talk about McIntyre, we can talk about Godmore, and we can talk about, sort of tradition over time. I've been doing a lot of family research over the last several years, and one of the things I discovered was that my very first ever ancestor, who came to Maryland from Scotland, died in 1699, and when he died, he came and he was a Quaker, and I know exactly what Quaker congregation he was part of and what Quaker community he was part of. And so my ancestors came to the New World as persecuted Quakers from Scotland, and I'm so proud of that. And Quakers, of course, have a whole set of views about church and state. It was one of the dominating, driving ideas behind Quakerism, being nonconformist with the king and the imperial church. And so that's their tradition. He dies in 1699, and in his will, there are 3 people that he's held in slavery that he gives to his wife. And he's in trouble when he passes away. The Quaker church in Easton, Maryland, the Quaker community in Easton, Maryland, is disciplining him. It doesn't say what they're disciplining him about, but I wonder if he got in a quarrel with them about slavery. And he dies in the middle of it. And so then his wife, who is also a Quaker, they were married by the Quaker meeting in 1678. So his wife inherits these 3 bodies of enslaved people. And what happens? She gets in trouble with the Quakers. And so what does she do? Because the Quakers are saying, no slavery. Everyone has the inner light. Every person is fully equal. A whole vision of citizenship in God's kingdom, of what it means to live in society, et cetera, et cetera. Quakers say no. She quits the Quakers, and guess what she does? She joins the Anglicans. And the Anglicans, of course, say, oh, yeah, slaves, cool. That's just part of the great chain of being. Right. And so sure. You can be a great Christian and a really faithful one as a slaveholder. And so my very first American family had to make a decision about their views of church and state that revolved around property and wealth and their status in community and how they were going to live in the world. That's how central these questions are. And so they're not theoretical. Every single family, everybody has some ancestry story like that. And yet people wouldn't think about, that's not a faith and politics story. Yes, it is. They made a decision about how they were going to understand faith and politics. And that gave my ancestor the out she needed in order to keep her slaves.
Oh,
Yeah. Oof.
All right, Tim.
Uh,
Tim's going to share for a minute and probably disturb us, or for some of you, if it was like me
Speaking
when
of
I
bad
met Tim.
news, Tim, come on in.
When I met Tim, I was like, nah, there can't be that many people.
Yeah. Well, okay. I guess here we go. Thanks, Strip, for that warm handoff. Yeah. Oh, there I am. I am kind of the bad news person around here, and God bless Trip and Diana. Mainly Trip. I mean, Diana is very much aware of what's going on. But when Trip and I first met, maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, and started getting friendly, I just started texting him, things I was seeing, and he really couldn't believe it. And now we're doing this together. So, listen, it's great to be here. And again, thanks for tuning in and listening to this. I thought what I would do is just kind of share my story a little bit and my experience in the white evangelical world, and kind of give the reason why we're doing this. There is a serious sense of urgency from my perspective. And sometimes I feel and believe that not even just conservative Christians, but like many mainline Christians, even some progressive mainline Christians, don't really understand how dire the situation is right now, especially in the American context, and how, whether we like it or not, a Christian stream of thought is fueling so much of what we're seeing. So I'm going to just kind of shock you right away. As many of us know, Trump was convicted. He is now a convicted felon on 34 counts. This is another, for a lot of us who might be not a big Trump fan, this is what we all knew already, but a court of law finally found him guilty. Well, today, a Christian music artist, the term is called CCM, released a song talking about this. And I'm going to share it with you, maybe just about half of the songs. You can hear what it's like being in my world. All right. So hopefully you all can see this. Hopefully you all can hear this. Here we go.
In trouble bigly time after time. He's controversial, but one thing is true: imperfect people, a perfect God can use. I'm standing with the chosen one.
I am the chosen one.
Ain't no stopping what the Lord's begun. He's only human like you and me, just a chosen one.
Somebody had to do it.
A little bit longer. We're almost there. I want you to really
This great nation is under attack, and its real leader has arrows in his back. So many greet him with a Judas kiss, but God gave us a warrior for such a time as this.
Okay. All right. Are you okay? Everyone hanging in there? Let's check our pulses. Yeah. That's a real video by a real Christian music artist, and that video is for real. I mean, it's not satire. And I've been asking myself more and more, how did I get here? Because I grew up in a space that really has birthed this. I grew up on a steady diet of talk radio. I listened to Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity most of my adult life, and also teenager life and child life. I found Ben Shapiro. I listened to him for a long time. So I really was kind of baptized in this space. In fact, one story I'll tell you for all of you folks who might not fully understand what it's like being an evangelical teenager. There's the March for Life that happens every year. It's where a bunch of pro-life people, mostly evangelicals and Catholics, go and they march. And I was part of like that Christian world that would do that. And I was also into this like heavy music that was also Christian, very rebellious on paper. And I had a shirt that I was given that I wore proudly. I was 15 years old. And the shirt read, "Abortion is homicide," in massive font. I mean, you couldn't miss it. And on the back, it said, "You will not silence my message. You will not mock my God. You will stop killing my generation." And so that's just kind of how I grew up, being in this world of fighting for these Christian values and fighting for permission to pray in school, all of those things. And one of the things that I have come to realize more than ever is that in this evangelical framework that a lot of us grew up in, there was a big obsession with the word truth. And I'm defining truth as something that corresponds to reality. So a lot of people, the apologetics industry, they make a living off of telling Christians, mainly evangelicals, why they can believe these things to be true, whether it's a biblical claim, whether it is a moral claim, an ethical claim, etc. So I grew up in this world. I grew up in this world that said, hey, we're going to give you truth. And we're going to give you what it looks like to order your life around God and what the Bible clearly teaches. So I did all of that. And as time went on, eventually when Trump came on the scene and others, I started realizing that these same people who were emphatic about objective, immovable truth and it being found in God's word were actually willing to change that truth, or at least be okay with erasing that truth if it fit their political agenda. So the textbook case is this: in the 90s, when Bill Clinton did what he did, you had a lot of people, evangelical leaders, who were like, hey, listen, we can't have a man in the office lead the country if he can't lead his family. This is an egregious sin, which, by the way, it was. That doesn't change anything. What Bill Clinton did was immoral and terrible. And so a lot of evangelical leaders seized on that and said, look, how can we trust a man to lead the nation if he can't lead his family? And then in 2016, when Trump comes on the scene and the tapes are released about Trump saying what he said about grabbing women, those same evangelicals, I mean, literally the same ones, like Franklin Graham, suddenly said, no, you don't understand. We need a commander-in-chief, not a pastor-in-chief. So I have seen this shift of this world that tells you they're obsessed with truth. They're obsessed with knowing truth. And also, we are the arbiters of that truth. Consistently reinvent what it means for something to be true if it fits their political ideology. And my current working theory that I would love to hear expanded upon from actual theologians and historians like Tripp and Diana is, I believe that for many white evangelicals, Trump is their ultimate epistemology. Trump is their anchor of what is true in the world. If Trump says the election is stolen, it doesn't matter what data comes out. The election is stolen. If Trump says he's innocent, it doesn't matter what data comes out. Trump is innocent. And I got to say, as someone who grew up in that world and believed it and then saw this, it's very jarring. It's very jarring to watch people that raised you as a child just completely do a 180 and take these dogmatic statements and beliefs as foundational realities. And so part of my work with the new evangelicals has really been exposing and also understanding Christian nationalism and the threat it poses to democracy and our neighbors. And I just want to kind of walk you through a few different things that are happening right now in the current evangelical world. And also, I will say, there is a stream of this in Catholic spaces as well, but I'm not Catholic, so I stay in my lane. And there's plenty to critique on white evangelicalism. So right now, a couple of things you should know about. Trump is found guilty. Trump says he's innocent. There's a whole army of evangelical leaders like Franklin Graham, Eric Metaxas, and others who are now saying, yes, Trump is innocent. This is a sham trial. In fact, Eric Metaxas Eric Metaxas released a Instagram picture where he essentially compared the innocence of Trump to the innocence of Jesus and said, don't forget, you worship a man who was found guilty. You can vote for one too. This is the world. This is the space that is shaping the minds of millions of white evangelicals. Eric Metaxas has a huge program. He podcasts daily. There is a consistent push of just disinformation. I'm not talking about blurry things like how do we deal with ethics and morals. I understand these things can be nuanced. I'm talking about things that just blatantly are not true. They're just blatantly not true. And then you have to realize, friends, that this white evangelical bubble is they have built the tunnels and infrastructure that disseminate this kind of thinking. So the January 6th insurrection, there was a whole movement behind the scenes of white evangelical charismatics called the New Apostolic Reformation that fueled the violence that we saw that day. And this is Matthew Taylor's work. You can find more about that. There are shadow networks of Christian billionaires who fund these groups. Turning Point USA is run by a man named Charlie Kirk. He's 30 years old, and he is on his program reaching millions of people saying things like this is not an exaggeration. You know, whenever I see a black pilot, I get a little bit worried because of DEI initiatives. Now, this man claims to be a Christian. He claims to be a Bible-believing Christian and that his faith compels him to do the work that he does today. This is what Christian nationalism is doing. And they are powerfully funded. They are working deep in state legislatures to try and change society radically. That's just the reality of the situation. And sometimes people will tell me, well, Tim, this is a fringe movement. This is fringe stuff. And let me just kind of address that very briefly. A couple of things you should know. First, in one way, some of this stuff is actually fringe, meaning if you look at the actual data, this is like PRI data, about 30% of the country holds to some kind of Christian nationalist ethos or ideal. Now, 30% is a big number, but it's not the majority. However, it's not about something being fringe. It's about the power to enact something that is fringe. And Christian nationalism as an ethos does not respect things like democracy when it doesn't benefit them. Remember, Christian nationalism is an opportunist movement. So if democracy benefits them, it's cool. If it doesn't, it must go. They reject things like pluralism. A lot of you in the chat are saying I'm talking Project 2025. Absolutely, but it's even bigger than that. Project 2025 is simply the culmination of what's been happening for years behind the scenes. Project Blitz is a big movement that's been happening. And again, there have been shadow networks of people funding this stuff to put people in key positions of power to not make the country more Christian in the sense of, hey, maybe affordable healthcare should be a thing, but making it more Christian in the sense of, hey, gay people, maybe we should put them in prison. Maybe women shouldn't have the right to vote. Maybe atheists should be put in jail. And all of those things are real quotes said by real Christian nationalists who write books, who have the ear of millions of people consistently. If you need receipts, you can DM me. This is what we're up against. And it's been jarring to see my Christian tradition that shaped so much of how I understood Christianity be a part or be one of the biggest levers that have pushed this. And so my job a lot of times online is kind of exposing this stuff. But where I fall short is thinking about what do we do as Christians? Because I deal in the space, it's known as deconstruction. People who maybe for the first time are kind of coming out of this world of evangelical fundamentalism, Christian nationalism, and going, what do I do? How do I stay Christian? Is this the only way of being Christian? How do these teachings of Jesus don't align with the ethics I'm seeing from my tradition? What do I do? And so I'm very much in that space. And in a lot of ways, I'm still exploring myself, which is why I'm so honored to be a part of this series, because I'm desperately looking for other ways of being Christian that are resistant maybe to empire, right? And resistant to Christian nationalism, but are also very much grounded in allegiance to Jesus. So that's kind of a snapshot of the work I do and where I'm at with this stuff. I will tell you, it is urgent. It's an urgent thing. And if we're not careful, we really could lose democracy in some serious ways. So that's all I got.
Oh my gosh, Tim. It's actually hard to know kind of what to ask you. I mean, I think it's worthwhile pointing out to people that the 2 videos this week will be from Robert Jones from Public Religion Research and Julie Ingersoll.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, who's written about Christian Reconstruction. She's a professor at University of North Florida. And so they're going to go more into some of the statistics and the sort of the historical background of these things. A number of people are asking about Catholic participation in this too. And I think that will come up with both of them too. So I just want to sort of underscore that for people. I guess, Tim, when I was listening to you, I thought you're walking a really good line because you were criticizing the ideas, but I think you were trying to hold on to the dignity of people. I mean, even though when you were criticizing Eric Metaxas, I didn't hear you say anything like, "Oh, Metaxas is an idiot and you can't trust anything he says because he's just a liar." But instead, you pointed towards his actions and the influence of his audience, and how he on his own biblical standards he fails. So, sort of talk to us a little bit more about that. What is it like to stay in conversation and try to retain the dignity of the people whose ideas you're criticizing, while at the same time having that sense of urgency that you so clearly have?
Yeah, there's kind of a dualism here for me as far as how my personality works, where I think publicly we have to just say the quiet parts out loud and be very blunt about, hey, this is a real danger and problem to all of our neighbors, especially our most marginalized ones. And I think it's important to expose. I mean, Eric Metaxas, I've shared this with both of you, in his book, Letter to the American Church, says that pastors who hang Black Lives Matter and pride flags today are just like the pastors in Nazi Germany that hung Nazi flags in their church. I mean, that's a real quote from his book. I think it's like page 52. I have it. And you're like, what? I mean, I want to say things that are just going to be like, what a, piece of trash, right? This is horrible. The other side of this, though, is that I'm very much in the field. I'm very much committed to the idea of once we start behaving like how these folks do, which is really built on dehumanization, right? They call people demons and all this stuff. Once we do that, once we kind of get in the mud, then we're on the same path that they're on at some point. And I believe ultimately dehumanization always leads to violence. And so, people always ask, people who want to get me in the corner always ask, because they think that I'm just going off of my feelings, in this conservative evangelical space, because I'm affirming and stuff. They go, well, what's a biblical teaching that you don't like? Like, easy, loving your enemies. I don't want to love my enemies. Okay. Like, I want to destroy my enemies personally sometimes, but there's a calling for the Christ follower to love their enemy. And I don't think that means enable their enemy. I think it means this both and posture of behind the scenes. Diana, I talk to these people. I mean, I've been to America Fest. I've met Charlie Kirk. I have drinks with some of these folks just to have that, hey, I'm a human, you're a human. We have to reason together. So there's that side. And then there's also the other, which is like, and also just so you know, publicly, I'm going to oppose you at every step of the way, because what you're doing is harming so many folks that I call my friends and my neighbors. And until you see that, I'm going to keep talking about it. My goal ultimately is, of course, you want to prioritize voices that are marginalized 100%, while also walking this tightrope of having a posture of openness so people can repent and go the other way. My goal for someone like Charlie Kirk is not that he doesn't exist anymore. That would be horrible. My goal is that he repents, and that we're able, as Dr. Roberto often says, that we recycle and compost supremacy. Not that we destroy it, because it's too violent of a term, is what he argues. I actually like that. I'm very compelled with that. How do we compost these things and make them rich soil that can promote the flourishing of all of our neighbors, not just the white evangelicals?
Yeah, I really appreciate this. And Tim, I think one of the reasons why I actually do admire you a great deal, and appreciate the honesty that you bring to this whole conversation. Walter Wink, who was a Lutheran theologian at the end of last century, the very beginning of this, wrote a whole series of books on political power. And he wrote a lot about the powers and principalities of this world. And he wasn't a Quaker. I mean, he's a guy from one of the magisterial establishment traditions of Protestantism, and yet he wrote about how it's the powers that are corrupted. And you just made that and they can be demonic. But that's different from what I think that you're trying to maintain that, saying it's not the people who are demons, but it's these things.
Yes. There is a narrative that I like. I picked this up from Tim Mackey in the Bible Project. So maybe it's a little too evangelical for some of the people out there, but for me, it's been helpful. And the way that he talks about it is, and I kind of riffed off of this idea, is that I believe that humans have the ability to partner with with demonic forces, so to speak. And demonic forces are simply agents of chaos, kind of how I think about them, right? They have one goal, essentially to bring hell on God's good earth and creation. And so humans can do that. I mean, we see what's happening right now in Gaza. We can see what happens when humans partner with demonic influences to wreak and sow havoc on earth that brings hell on earth to real people. So the question I like to pose to my audience is, we can choose to partner in cycles of goodness and creation and love and flourishing, or we can choose to partner in cycles of violence and chaos. Which way do we want to go? And then what's the fruit of the theology that we're holding? I think it's pretty evident to look at, broadly speaking, the Christian nationalism ethos and see how, unless you're assimilated into that world and you're maybe a white man, or you're someone who's willing to see them at the top of the hierarchy, everyone else is really dehumanized by that movement and is underneath the thumb of that. To me, that's not human flourishing. To me, that is a cycle of chaos, right? It does harm our neighbors. So the question we have to ask then is, how do we maintain the fact that these are humans and they're making a choice every day to do this? And that's a problem. We want to warn them of that, and also stand with our marginalized neighbors, while also not forgetting that, yes, Eric Metaxas is a fully formed human being made in the image of God. So we have to wrestle with that as Christians, I think.
Yeah, I'm turning this over to Trip here, but that to me seems it's almost a central issue around faith and politics, and maybe that's why so many people in churches, in these more liberal churches that I'm in, don't want to talk about it, because they see the possibilities that are almost seem inherent whenever you get into the discussion of faith and politics, of that demonization or the us and the them. Of the other. And so maybe our church doesn't talk about faith and politics is a kind of a smokescreen or a shorthand way of saying is we don't want to get into the arguments where it's possible for us to enter into demonizing people who are in our own community.
Yeah.
So I just really appreciate that. Trip, you follow up with Tim there.
Oh, Tim has made me lose so much sleep. And I actually think with y'all two's conversation combined, I think you see why when you're coming out of a space that is closed, that does have a walled system, that draws boundaries, that thinks the tradition's finished, then you don't know what to do in a public square where other voices exist and other bodies deserve recognition and protection and such. And so that invitation to think in a living tradition is something that involves a modality shift. And I think in different ways, mainline Protestants haven't figured out what to do with that, given our current context. And you can see in the present the way a kind of a post-Vatican II Catholicism has a multiplicity of different options. And so I think this moment, like what you're describing, Tim, it's surprising to me how the inherited even options within the tradition that came about really post World War II all have glaring problems in the present, and there's not a constellation of traditions of new orientations to coming out of the faith and towards the future. And that's why I'm excited about this class, is hearing people that are trying to re-articulate the tradition in learning from other parts of it in the present. It's because there isn't real obvious consensus, even at a granular level within a denomination or within a single church and such. So your existential crisis, I don't think it's just people that are freaked out by Christian nationalism.
No, that's true. And by the way, I just want to say I love the living tradition motif. I think it's such a great mental framework of what we're actually trying to do. I think about Scott McKnight's book, The Blue Parakeet. He kind of talks about this idea of, every generation of Christians has to take the Christian tradition and interpret it in their day and their way, is kind of how he phrases it. And that was a game changer for me, and I'm still getting used to that, because I grew up in I was just kind of taught like, hey, the cement was poured 2,000 years ago. It's hardened. Here it is. And it's like, I feel like it's much more moldable. And we're all shaping this thing kind of differently depending on what room in the Christian tradition you're a part of. And so I think that for people maybe who are coming from my audience to this, a lot of them are just really thirsty for hearing about these other ways that are so Christian. They make Christian nationalism look completely antichrist. And we're like, yes, I'm in. So I'm definitely excited. It's going to be great.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Now, Trip, it's your turn.
Yay.
All right. Well,
Birthday
I'm going to try to be shorter.
And Tim, you'll get to ask Trip a couple questions at the end of his talk. So
can't wait.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to attempt to be brief, which is not one of my spiritual gifts, but picking up on like Tim's angst and the framing of tradition and love that Diana gave. I think one of the challenges in the present is just naming all that's going on that contemporary political theologians are wrestling with, and then what do the traditions that we're inheriting look like? When you look at the present, there have been a number of major shifts. One is in for much of church history, from Constantine on of sort, the church was dominant, and then the political organization and our economic relations were kind of overdetermined by the church. And then after the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the emergence of democracy, and then the emergence of free markets and the church. And you can imagine, like in the heyday of Christianity, where in America, the state had power and it worked with the market and the church. But today, we're increasingly aware that the market is now at the top, and even the state and religions have become subservient to it. I think we also see shifts in just the means of persuasion, right? If politics is how we communicate, relate, and figure out life together, just moving historically from face-to-face conversations, the advent of representative governments, the emergence of different technology like text to algorithms, all these things that mediate our relations and persuasion, and what are the subtle and unexamined or unconscious powers at any of them? Those are all at play today, and we aren't aware of them. And it's something that requires reflection before just getting to an answer. Our time period is one where there's an intense alienation from community. The modern world hasn't experienced, at least in America, in this intense way. There's more geographical movement, right? That you live next to people you don't know their name, and you go to work in a car where you don't know your neighbor's name, and you don't worship at a parish or go to a local pub. All those things, this movement alienates us from face-to-face contact across difference. We self-select communities and spaces now. There's an increasing volume of immigration that's going to go up for economic and ecological reasons that will continue to change community, generating alienation, because we notice it psychologically more when it's in front of us. There's increasing social isolation, and there's institutional decline in politics and in the church and in the economic system. All these things are part of shifts that are going on. And I think the other element that raises the anxiety meter is the breadth and depth of the problems that are on our agenda, if we're going to talk about faith and politics at the same time, are ones that are just bigger. The breadth and depth of the problems are huge. Until there was a nuke, you don't have to talk about nukes. Until you're aware of the ecological crisis and our dependence on big oil consumption in an economy that demands growth, you don't worry about the ecological collapse. More people are becoming aware of AI and the way it engages in surveillance, the way it's being used in military conflicts. That you don't ask that question until it exists. Biological engineering. A state can legislate something in one continent, but our funding can go to another continent, and then things erupt. And once it's in the gene pool, you go ahead and figure out if true love can wait when the genetics have been altered. I mean, the shifts taking place are huge. And also in the American context, there are challenges that are unique to this moment that perhaps our traditions can't answer on their own. For example, there's an increasing diversity in the American populace. You could see the migration, right, from a Protestant nation to a Christian nation to a Judeo-Christian nation to and then Obama is the first president to acknowledge non-religious neighbors, right, from the pulpit of democracy. There's the crisis of identity. America doesn't know what to do now that we're no longer the sole superpower. We have failed at exporting democracy, which was a rallying cry across Protestantism's theological commitments in the past. There's deep institutional suspicion among the people. All those things, that identity crisis that's going on, levels up the anxiety and demands a different framework for thinking. There's also a vacuum when it goes to our agency. Yes, There's apathy and cynicism in politics. But this apathy and cynicism, when you realize how little connection we have to what gets itself done in the political world, it has had this shift where both of our parties, which generate enough disgust that there are only ones as options, have turned to battles in culture over wrestling with policy. We are in a crisis because of historical amnesia in the battle of a shared story as a nation. Yes, more and more voices and experiences have been brought in, but that's also generated silos of storytelling that you can see even in state legislatures as we battle over schools and textbooks. And last, I would mention that there is an expansion, one that a lot of Protestantism in America has had a hard time wrestling with, mainline Protestants the most, and that's an expansion of those who feel disinherited from the American dream. The number of people growing up in middle-class homes where the parents and grandparents are not optimistic that their children will inherit what they've, the opportunities they had, or even get to a similar status in the world and such is intense. But if that was assumed in the formation of your institution, what success looked like and all that kind of stuff, it's crazy how much it changes things, the demands. So you can see that in a lot of the generational divide. But those that are the disinherited from the American dream used to be something that was a political project, right? The war on poverty, the expanding the right to vote, these kinds of things. And now our economic system, which drives the state and the church, is narrowing those who feel like it's a part of something they participate in. And so naming that, I want to briefly say the five, and I had text exchange with 6 different theologians that teach theology and ethics or theology and politics classes and said, what would you do for a typology? And so I made the typology based on the ones that got mentioned at least 3 times and included as many voices as possible in it. So there are 5 options, and I'm going to throw a quote in the chat from like an archetypal theologian for each one. And so the first option is the pacifist and anarchist option. And here, the archetypes. And I'm picking people that were kind of the end of the last century, because like I said, all these problems, challenges, and pressures are forcing a reworking of the tradition. And these individual elements and expressions don't work all on their own anymore. Hybridity is run amok. And each of the scholars you're going to hear from in the second and third weeks, those 4 scholars represent blends of these. So I tried to pick archetypal quotes and expressions. But the pacifist and anarchist tradition, here represented by someone like Ellul or Yoder in the Mennonite tradition. Ellul says this: every modern state is totalitarian. It recognizes no limit, either factual or legal. This is why I maintain no state in the modern world is legitimate. No present-day authority can claim to be instituted by God, for all authority is set in the framework of a totalitarian state. This is why I decide for anarchy. Jacques Ellul, Christian anarchist, an inspiration to a lot of the neo-monastic movement today, the Mennonite tradition, the Anabaptists and such. Obviously, Yoder comes out of that as well. And he was quite influential before his ethical concerns became public. But when you think of this tradition, politics is seen as a negation of freedom to engage in the political sphere, for your agency, hopes, and desires to get expressed there is a negation of your Christian freedom, and it problematizes your ultimate allegiance to Christ. This tradition is grounded in the politics of Jesus, a deep commitment to nonviolence, and that commitment to nonviolence in modernity recognizes that the modern state primarily is determined by its military. A military that serves the economic ends of its elites and is ruled by an oligarchy. Seeing the modern state for what it is revealed in World War II, Ellul will say modernity was revealed in Auschwitz and Hiroshima. And if that sounds shocking, look him up on YouTube. It only takes 2 hours of watching him talk to think he's right for at least 30 minutes. And if you go to bed then, you could have nightmares. Also, it insists that world management is not a Christian vocation. Jesus rejected it in his temptation, and for some reason, the church decided it would be good for the cross bearers people to be the cross builders. And that is a problem. To do that, to see your identity perform there, is inherently problematic. Christian politics is as public witness in this tradition, and it's a public witness to the state as an alternative people with an alternative story. All right, I'm lapsing from going into my Baptist sermon here. The second option are the different liberation traditions. This is a quote from Gustavo Gutierrez that got picked up in a host of different places within American political theology. You could see it in the feminist movement. You could see it in black theology. Someone like James Cone is a pinnacle example in this place. He says that the work of Christ is presented simultaneously as liberation from sin and from all its consequences, despolition, injustice, and hatred. This liberation fulfills in an unexpected way the promises of the prophets and creates a new chosen people, which this time includes all humanity. Theologians within the liberation tradition ground their theological reflection in the narrative of Exodus and the revelation of the cross. In the Exodus and in the cross, God takes sides in a political, social, cultural sphere. The beginning of theology is when God says, "Let my people go." The beginning of theology is solidarity with the cross dead, not the cross builders. When the revelation of God, the self-testimony of God, is electing us people of slavery and bringing liberation and electing the one that dies cross dead for the inbreaking of new creation, then you don't get to think theologically in ways that normalize cross-building, exploitation, and the power and voice of the few, the privileged. This tradition began in many ways because the Marxist analysis that was taking place in Anglo-European thought found its way into those that are being exploited by the Western Anglo world. And the Marxist analysis isn't like ultimately final. It's not there, but it unveiled political idols that demand sacrifice. You'll see this across all the liberation theologians, that the revelation of our true religion is to identify those being killed and sacrificed. And what are we being sacrificed to? We're being sacrificed to our allegiance to the nation, our allegiance to profit, our allegiance to growth, and these kinds of things. Identifying idols, you look for the sacrifice and work backwards. That is an invitation that the liberation tradition brings. That means it involves a critical assessment and a delegitimation of existing political structures. The liberation tradition does not want to take as status quo the system and institutions that are present, because they're the ones that gave birth to a world that puts people on crosses in the name of God, freedom, liberty, justice, and the American way. The liberation tradition is aware of the question of violence and how Jesus challenges it, but it also says, hey, too often the perspective of the oppressors frames the conversation about violence. And so you could see them saying to upper middle class white mainline Protestants who are like, yes, but what about this? Going, yeah, well, okay, if you're telling us not to have violence, and this is a critique the liberation tradition pushes against King, then you're acting as if it's natural, the passive and state violence that keeps poor and black bodies locked up, incarcerated, and you go on and on. Right? So it wants to recognize this, and that means power analysis comes first because God's taken sides. Exodus, cross. All right. Another perspective that is a huge one from the post-war is a neoconservative perspective. Here is a quote from John Newhouse, but he was a hugely influential, helped found First Things, and this is from the founding documents for the Institute on Religion and Democracy. He said, the USA is the primary bearer of democratic possibility in the world today. The Soviet Union is the primary bearer of totalitarian alternative. For better or worse, each is a global force, and between them, there's no pattern of smooth convergence, but of real and potential conflict. More profound than the conflict of military and political forces, however, is the conflict over the dignity and destiny of the human person and the societal order appropriate to that dignity and that destiny. The neoconservative option in political theology are ones that recognize this promise in democracy. They recognize the promise in democracy, and it's something to be cherished. And that is a way of understanding the way they inherit, right? That chosen nation status. That, like, how do we resolve the conflict that's going on when human beings run amok as sinners? We have to negotiate things. And democracy is the privileged way of doing so. It also advocates the need for a limited state. right? The neoconservative element. Why? Because the state's temptation at the macro level is the same temptation of the individual towards sin, towards pride, towards over-determining the reality of those around you for your own well-being. So we need a limited state that preserves political and religious freedom. And that means at the very heart of it is the indispensability of capitalism. God's the preservation of democracy means the preservation of free markets, because the moment that freedom disappears, the promise of open free exchange disappears. And you can see right here, right, how if you imagine the human predicament in a particular way, and you see this vocation of America as an essential element in this group, you go, oh, well, we have to defend. We need limited power of the state. We need to preserve democracy, probably expand democracy through our foreign policy. And America has a particular vocation. And then what do you do in the free space of ideas in America? Well, that means that the public, political, and moral witness of the church is intertwined. And this movement ended up shaping the emergence of right-wing politics, both in Catholic and Protestant spheres. Another one is the emergence of evangelicalism as a political actor, and it happens on the right and left. So here's a quote from Pat Robertson: "But let us not stop short until there's a complete restoration of the time-honored traditions of this nation, the complete fall of liberalism, and God's blessings are once again laid upon this land." And then Jim Wallace, a left evangelical, says, "Whether religious or not, Americans are hungry for a deeper connection between politics and moral values. Many would say spiritual values." And he goes on to complain about the religious right having monopolized a conversation as the moral majority, and says these people must be brought back into the public discussion. We need them, those with a hunger. Right. And underneath this, when you just think about the modality of the way their faith engages a public square, where for a large part of evangelicalism prior, they were fanatical about the separation of church and state and kind of apolitical, is that here political theology generates movement politics, and that it's actually part of discipleship. It also, both sides frame their political engagement in a narrative of moral decay. You look at America in the cultural zeitgeist, the moment you see moral decay, and then therefore the need for spiritual renewal. What the fruits of it look like are different in each side, but you can see that evangelical spirit being shaped this way, organizing for movement, discipleship, and action. You see moral decline, and you advocate for this renewal. And this meant that there was a kind of organizing and an organizing for the animation of believers to engage politically. Political power became an enactment of one's faith, and that's something that was new. I know for those of you that are younger, that was new within evangelicalism in different ways. For example, Jerry Falwell was not a Southern Baptist for most of his life. He became one after they got rid of a lot of them. And his politicizing of it, even people that agreed with him early on politically were uncomfortable the way that he brought in politics. And that tradition is there, and it's being remorphed, right? As now people identify it even as evangelical, don't know the theology, and have no clue how to get to their church because they don't go, but they're just evangelical. And the last one is really the ecumenical Christian realist position. And I'm going to give two quotes here, because one is from someone I think that gives accurate depiction of the post-Vatican II expression in America. This is Charles Curran, who's a big Catholic ethicist. He said, "The Christian strives to make the kingdom more present in this world, but the fullness of justice and peace will never be here. I maintain that there can be some truly human progress in history, but such progress is ordinarily slow and painful." Donald Messer, who's a leader in the United Methodist Church, was president of Iliff Seminary for a long time, and a leader in the ecumenical movement in the response to the global HIV crisis. I find this quote, it captures it well. "A merit of avoiding absolutes is to remind one of the role of prudence in political decision making. Since at least the time of Aristotle, political ethics have underscored the imperative of seeking to find the mean between extremes, being less certain about the truth, recognizing the ambiguity of all political situations, tends to dampen one's excessive trust in any particular political policy. Now, this tradition, you can see here a number of features. You can see coming out of the social gospel movement, but it's optimism being chastened by the world wars. But underneath it is this sense that there is, and it used to be put this way, the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. But the gender stuff has been updated since then. But it's a recognition that our obligation to love our neighbor and to love God are intertwined, and you can't do one without the other. And this tradition takes sin seriously at multiple levels. Sin isn't just, right, the moral crisis of what's happening in individuals, where they go on the internet and what words they use and what's on the movie screen, and if there's a profanity label on their music. No. It takes sin seriously at multiple levels. And when you recognize sin is something that gets more problematic, the more humans are involved at the institutional level, then you're going to add the word "but" a number of times, right? Just like in Curran's line. And you're going to advocate for prudence, like you see in Messer's quote, because the human beings as a collective, we don't know the truth and we don't have access to it, and we will do the good, and we might do it horribly because we're blind to it. And we just have to know sin is our problem, and as a collective, it gets worse. This community is also institutionally invested. They pioneered ecumenical cooperation within the nation, and that framework, and thinking that institutions and ecumenical cooperation are the means of enacting one's theology in public, it meant they were committed to a transformation of culture. And you can see this since this is the group that advocated things like the 40-hour work week, the end of child labor laws, the introduction of the EPA. Like, you could go through tons of things that this community, as the dominant one of religion in America, has shaped so much. They were the advocates, right? Like when it goes to women's suffrage, like who was it that was organizing? You could see it. It was a work of this community. But underneath it, and this is something that people are trying to figure out now, is that this is an inherently reformist agenda, the institutional and ecumenical move, and not revolutionary. And in the end, it's advocating that reformist position is ultimately best for the world. So it resists revolution and radical change. It also recognizes the demand around violence for Jesus, but values the just war tradition and seeks to be the limiter for those that will engage in violence rather than the resistor. It wants to be the conscience of the institutions in the public square rather than prophetically critiquing it and lambasting it. And so this tradition, much like the neoconservatives, but for different ways, has a celebration of democracy at its heart, and values that democracy and the nation states emerge out of Protestantism, solving quite a few conflicts historically. And so it's something to be cherished and tended to. And so one's identity as a disciple is formed by forming you to be an advocate in all the different spheres of life you're in, as a citizen, as a worker, within your family, as a neighbor, as you volunteer. This form of life sees layers of places the disciple lives it out. And the church, in many ways, is helping to organize, inform, and empower people to be citizens of multiple kingdoms until the arrival of God's. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you an idea of the those are like the big five, frameworks at the turn of the century. I think
your mic's muted, Diana.
I was going to say the fire hose. I was not expecting the fire hose.
Well, I knew it had to be quick, so I cut out my stories.
No, I yeah, I had to be quick. What's it like being in your head, Trip? I mean, geez Louise. It's so helpful just to even get that. Like, wait, 5 different traditions. Oh, okay. I hear, you bring up like the liberation tradition. I'm like, okay, I've heard bits and pieces about that. I heard some of the I can't even repeat what I heard back, but I just heard a lot of elements that I was like, okay, yes, I recognize where that comes from. Oh, that's the source of that. Okay, put that in that box. So it was a very helpful crash course on those 5 different ways, I guess, of viewing faith and politics. It's hard to give a question because I'm just thinking so much now. I'm just trying to process what was a fire hose like this over the past like 10 minutes, trying to get as much water as I could. So
I think
it's
it was
very
20.
thought-provoking.
I think it was 20.
Whatever. 520, you know.
Well, I think it's worthwhile just to list the 5 again. The 1, pacifist anarchist. 2, liberation. 3, neoconservative option. Is that the best title for that? That was the one I was kind of wondering about. You didn't get to the title right away. It kind of took us down.
Yeah, so it's the pacifist anarchist, liberationist tradition, the neocons.
Okay, so that's the name of that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so evangelicals, left and right, evangelicalism as a political option, and then 5, ecumenical realists.
Okay, I have a question. Do these traditions are these things are they in harmony with each other? Are they riffing off each other? Or are they pretty I mean, obviously Pat Robertson with that exception, but you know, like do you see these things as like, hey, here are 5 distinct ways and you have to pick one? Or for you, is it like, well, no, like we can kind of learn from all of these and kind of create our own living tradition and kind of move forward by maybe picking the real bright spots in all of these and then forming our own thing? Like, how do you view that?
Well, yeah. So 2 things. One, in one version of this, I had like picked a Bible verse that each tradition would read first if you asked them about faith in the public square, because
I like
there
that.
it's once you recognize the diversity within the tradition, and that this conversation's been going on forever, right? Like Diana's already mentioned, most of these positions exist in the New Testament in some form. Then I think it's helpful to try to like in giving a typology and getting like the ideal set, then you can see the way they're inheriting the tradition. And these perspectives have inherited it and were live options, post World War II in America. And that's why at the front, the problems we're facing, I think none of them work perfectly going forward. And so, yes, I imagine in the future, there will be people will be blending. I know I personally do. And which you could probably tell just by what points I was making that I find most exciting.
Which ones?
Well, and even though I didn't have the framework that you spelled out ahead of time, I caught myself saying, "Oh yeah, I do pull from that part of that tradition, and I do pull. Okay, so I am pulling from some of that as well." I found myself kind of saying the same thing as you were going through.
Yeah, and it's one of the things about it that I think is helpful for this kind of conversation is we're going to hear people who are negotiating all these pressures and challenges and are inheriting a tradition, and that's their job to inherit it.
Right.
So as we hear from Jen and from Reggie and from Kevin, this kind of thing, you'll be able to pick up on how they are blending and inheriting it.
Yeah.
And like Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove blends them, and he like names it in his talk about the connection to movement politics. And then anyway, and you can see him pulling a biblical thread as how he does it in his lecture. And so by going, these existed at the turn of our century, and they all have grounding in the Christian tradition, even though we could power rank them on our preference and fidelity.
Right.
But they are there. They're a part of the church. Then by understanding what animated them, by understanding what moved them, by understanding how they understood things like sin or democracy or freedom and these kinds of things to shape them, then we can look at our own context and go, does that change as things get mediated algorithmically? Does it change now that the state has a hard time telling the market what to do? Does it change when our problems can't be legislated by a particular state but require global cooperation? Does it change when the shared populace is so diverse without a shared story? And so having a way of, by looking at these kind of crystallized ideals that were the last time we had like a real debate in the public square, it might help us understand why it is even scholars are like, I don't know exactly how to name it, what it is I'm doing, I think we're like at this in hell moment. If you think of the living tradition, like there was a big exhale of what public theology looked like in the post World War II. It all got worked out at the beginning of it after the wars. And now we're at this in hell moment, and the air we're breathing in is so different. And the people we're in community with are different, and the public square is different. And we don't know what's about to come out, but we know what kind of brought us into this moment. And that can help frame things.
I was kind of wondering, I mean, I think one of the worthwhile sort of tasks that we have ahead of us is that we do have these options that are very historically grounded and are recognizable. But you just hinted at something that I think is worthy of us tagging and kind of putting a pin on it for the future. And that is, I kept thinking, well, what's missing here? And there was, I was thinking about something that was like a pluralist mystical tradition, which is interesting because I was thinking of Merton, and I was thinking about what's the name of the Catholic monk who went to India? I can't remember his name. I was thinking about a little bit about Dorothy Day. I was thinking, so there's some Catholic tradition there that I think is missing and yet is incredibly appealing. It's very sacramental. It is driven in sense by the life of prayer. It's incredibly internalized, but that those deep sort of mystical connections have a public expression that is universal. Oh, B. Griffith. Yeah, that's a person I was thinking about. There's another one too. I can't remember his name, but I will remember it by the time the call, probably after we get off the call. So that's just one I'd like to sort of put a little tag on, because I think it's really kind of appealing, and it often shows up in Judaism too. I was thinking about some of the Holocaust literature and Jewish sort of mystics. Buber, I think, kind of moves there, even though he's more classified sometimes around the realist tradition. I think that he's got a more mystical, connected, kind of pluralist view. So anyway, just something that I want to Panicar. Thank you. That's exactly what I was thinking of, Janet Buchanan.
We did it.
Yeah, I knew somebody would come up with it. But see, all these people, they're pretty influential politically, and certainly I know that they've had a real influence on me. Yeah, I don't even know how to kind of explain them.
Right.
Yeah, I tend to obviously there were versions of it with 11 typologies, but I would think that in general they either the people that buy their books are Christian anarchists or mainline Protestants that pray,
or
like
or
the
Catholic
people that
mystics.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of the ecumenical side of things tend to be the kind of post Vatican II Catholic movement, really until of late. We won't go into recent popes have problematized it in different ways, but
I think it's just going to be something really fun to talk about. I think that some Orthodox people kind of fall in there, Schmemann maybe, as well. So anyway, just kind of an intriguing possibility of thinking about how the mystical and deeply spiritual sort of functions differently in political terms than I think it did pre-World War II. I think just something to pay attention to. It's a kind of a Charles Taylor kind of
and that was something
random
you brought up
point.
in the first lecture that we did. The first thing you did during the 9/11 class with Brian, when you're looking at like that shift in spirituality after 9/11, and you can see its precursors and such before, but like today it would. Like if you're making it today, you would want a typology that the Center for Action and Contemplation typifies.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was thinking about. Where would I stick Richard Rohr or even Pope Francis? Because someone like Francis, you certainly see elements of liberation. You see the pacifist. You see ecumenical realist. You see, his anti-capitalism is so incredibly sharp and defined. And I think that comes out of his sort of mystical connections and prayer life, about the imitation of Christ. So anyway, just like I said, this is just, I really loved it. And I just want to kind of like, I think about not only should we think about what we're being presented as good options and historic ones and really important ones to get to know, but then open ourselves up towards that other thing. It's like, well, hey, if this is a living tradition, what are we making?
Right. I love it. I'm excited.
Well, good.
I
'Cause
think
you can't go
everybody's
anywhere.
gonna want an outline of your 5 traditions trip, and you're
Yeah,
gonna have
I'll
to
want
put
that.
Oh, I already
you're gonna have to
emailed it
put
to
the
you, Tim.
Bible verses
Oh
in
yeah,
there.
I can add stuff back in there.
Okay. Yeah, I had
You
this
can also
document.
see the outline for the second half. You know,
Yeah,
where
I see it.
how the
Okay, I'm looking at
different
it now.
Christian loci have questions reformed in light of current pressures and challenges. But yeah,
Anyway.
Well, we'll
yeah.
get
But
that
remember,
later on.
any of you can send question reply to the email you get tomorrow for questions and such. And if you send replies about it, I make typologies quite regularly. It helps me think. So if you have questions about it, or even names, I could probably just stick them on the document, then send it to everyone. Or if you have enough questions, I might just have to send a whole video of the long version, because there was a longer version.
I'm not surprised.
I'm furiously texting Trip, going, "Not so many details. Get to the point."
Yeah.
Oh, you did text me.
I did text you that because people were really getting anxious to hear they wanted to hear the whole list. I could tell in the comments and stuff. And so I was like,
well, I'm glad I didn't look at my phone. My phone is just so
three.
many people texting birthday texts that I just am like, I can't look at it.
I'm loved too much. I can't pay attention to it right now.
Yeah, that's what it is. But this has been a lot of fun. Everyone, you'll get questions. You can send your questions to any or all of us tomorrow in responding to the email. You'll get the videos for this next week. I know a number of you are hanging out in groups. Then if you have a question or a topic that comes up in your group quite a bit, then send it and let us know. Not just your name, but the group name. And then, because then the question is representing a collective, not just the person, when power ranking topics to discuss. And in the email, I'll make sure we have links to where you can find how to connect with Tim and Diana and I in our own places and such, like on podcasts and Substacks and all that kind of thing. But yeah,
awesome.
I think it was a great start, and the three of us just really, I think, introduced our passions and also kind of the flow of where we're going to go. So we're going to hold on to history. We've got these sort of guidelines from the past, the idea of living tradition. We got Tim's reminder of urgency and like this. This is a real thing, and it's not just theoretical. It's influencing millions of people right now. So we have to hold on to that. And Trip, I just really appreciate the 5 typologies and the idea of, hey, maybe let's think of what's being birthed among us today.
Yeah.
Are there 6th or 7th, 8th possibilities that haven't been possible before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. At least I hope so, because I got problems with all 5 of them in ways that I hope there's new options. So you have to wait till the very end, where the synthesis of all things come together for the final, closed, ultimate, sincere answer for all time. And Tim's going to tell it to us in the form of a CCM song with pictures of the true political Messiah.
I'm writing it right now.
I don't know who it's going to be.
Flamey Grant. That's who I'm writing it with. So.
All right. Bye.